Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight's review is dedicated to the lovely Dana. You know who you are, young lady. So, we're going to be talking about Sleepwalker, issues 1 through 11, the introductory arc of the series. Sleepwalker was created by writer and artist Bob Budiansky, and the first issue of the series came out in June of 1991. But this wasn't the first time that Budiansky had tried to do something with the character. Sleepwalker's genesis goes all the way back to the 1970s, and during which Budiansky came up with the basic designs and concepts for the character and had decided to name him Alien, literally the word alien. But in 1979, there was a little movie directed by Ridley Scott that was also called Alien, that in turn went on to be a sci-fi and horror masterpiece. Once that hit the screen, Budiansky decided to shelve his character for several years, but it wasn't until, say, the beginning of the 90s in which Budiansky had decided to take a second shot with his character. He dusted off the cobwebs, made some revisions, and changed the name of the character from Alien to Sleepwalker, and thus a new character was born. And Sleepwalker came out at a rather interesting time in comic books in general, as well as Marvel Comics specifically, because this was during the dark age of comics, which began in 1985, and depending on who you talk to, is still ongoing today. But basically, there was a big push to make characters more mature, which in turn resulted in several characters being born, creatively speaking, who were quite grim and quite gritty. Or there were pre-existing characters who were given a sort of darker edge for a time. But you had characters such as Wolverine and Punisher, who, while having been created in the 70s, received a huge boost in popularity in the 80s and especially the 90s. And you also had new characters such as Cable, the Danny Ketch version of Ghost Rider, came out in the 90s as well, and they were definitely grim, they were definitely gritty. And I'm not saying this to slight them, but that was the fact. They were very dark characters. But there was also a certain optimism and inspiration that managed to shine through at times during the 90s. And I say that because there was a certain courage and enthusiasm that writers and artists had, both at Marvel and DC Comics, and independent comics as well, in which they, were daring enough to try and create new characters. And sometimes, this resulted in, some successes. I mean, you had, for Marvel Comics, for example, you had books like The New Warriors or Darkhawk, come out. And even the X-Men, while still being an ongoing series at the time, and still is to this day, there was, even though there was a certain darkness that was brought to the series during this time, there was also a certain optimism due to the courage and inspiration of the creative teams of the X-Men books. And so it wasn't just grim and gritty, but there were also bursts of light, so to speak. And I would argue that Sleepwalker, to an extent, was an example of that more optimistic result that came out of the dark age of comics. And to be sure, the series of Sleepwalker did have its darker elements, but for, I would say, the first 11 issues or so, there was a certain amount of wit and imagination that you can only find with a creative team wanting to do their best in creating a new character, and basically wanting to also have fun and bring in the readers to this fun as well. And you look at Sleepwalker, and he doesn't exactly look like someone who's optimistic and bright, so to speak. But he looks dark. He looks spooky. He looks like someone who'd be right at home in the grim and gritty trend. But he was actually one of the more outright heroic characters to come out of this dark time. And much like the character of Darkhawk, who also looked, dark and mysterious. The two of them, were, genuinely heroic characters. And so the story begins with the character of Rick Sheridan, who is an aspiring, filmmaker, and he's going to, a college in New York, taking film classes, and he's got a, pretty solid life. It has its struggles and everything, but he has a girlfriend, a beautiful woman, a very smart woman named Alyssa, who occasionally helps out with some of Rick's film projects. And he also has a very charming companion in the dog of a dog named Rambo, who is a very smart dog. And we even see within the first issue, Rick has somehow trained Rambo to basically turn on the alarm clocks, turn on the TV, turn on the radio whenever it's time for Rick to get up. Because one alarm clock, it's not going to do it. So, anyway, though, Rick, like I said, he's got a pretty solid life, at this point, and he has his dreams. He has his girlfriend. He has a circle of friends, but it's in his dreams that his troubles have just taken a rather dark turn. It turns out that there's actually this alien who is a denizen of what is called the Mindscape, which basically makes up the hopes and dreams and nightmares of all the sentient beings in the universe. And basically, there's a race of beings who in human tongue can only be called sleepwalkers, whose job it's basically to patrol the mindscape and keep hostile entities from invading the minds of humanity. And while this is something that tends to have a mixed rate of success, it's a job that they take very seriously. But there's one denizen of the mindscape that has basically butt heads with the sleepwalkers repeatedly, and is basically an ancient enemy of their race. And this entity, in the human tongue, it can best be described as Cobweb, because it looks like a humanoid, emaciated, version of a living, breathing set of cobwebs, and it's a very terrifying appearance, let me tell you. But basically, this demonic entity will go in the minds of any sentient being it can find, and basically just enslave them, and it make them delusional to a point where they see Cobweb as their friend, even when he's draining their mental essence. And once he's done with them, they'll be a vegetable, a living dead being, so to speak. But there's one particular member of the Sleepwalkers that was going after Cobweb in this particular instance, because he had actually managed to defeat Cobweb on more than one occasion. But in this particular moment, Cobweb had chosen the person of Rick Sheridan, to use his mind as a trap for this particular Sleepwalker. And basically, he lured Sleepwalker into Rick's mind and, trapped him there, to a point where Rick started to see Sleepwalker, anytime he fell asleep and dreamed. And he didn't know who this, ominous green, purple cloaked, person was, or this thing was. And the appearances became more and more menacing, more and more ominous. And it wasn't until Rick, in his dreams, physically confronted this creature, namely by ripping off this sort of amulet that was on this creature's chest, this sort of golden yellow star type amulet. And once Rick pulled that off, the creature burst into nothingness, and Rick felt that things were more in control, because whenever he was dreaming, this creature would pop up, this strange being, and he couldn't sleep properly. But once he ripped this amulet off the creature's chest, as far as he knew, he could sleep peacefully again. But it turns out that what Rick had done was he had actually ripped off the one device that this Sleepwalker had, that allowed him to, with certainty, face Cobweb, as well as whatever dark, monstrous denizens of the Mindscape there were that made their way into the head of Rick Sheridan. And so by doing so, Sleepwalker, this Sleepwalker in particular, was already trapped in Rick's mind and was trying to find a way out. But once Rick ripped this device off of him in his dreams, this Imaginator is what it's called, it created a side effect. So not only could this Sleepwalker not properly pursue Cobweb once he figured out a way to get out of Rick's mind, but it also made it more difficult for him to fight the denizens from the Mindscape that were of ill intent. But the main thing, though, is that it resulted in a sort of, not quite transformation, but it resulted in this phase where whenever Rick falls asleep, Sleepwalker, or this alien, would come out of his mind. And once this happened, Rick was terrified. He's convinced that there's a monster trapped in his mind, and he doesn't know who it is. He doesn't know what it wants. And since this creature only seems to come out when Rick sleeps, he's convinced that the only way you can keep this thing from getting out is by not sleeping. And so Rick does everything he can to stay awake, but this begins to take a toll on him. He starts messing up in school. He starts messing up in his film projects, and most grievously, he starts to ruin his relationship with Alyssa, because she doesn't know what's going on. All she knows is that he's never well rested. He's nodding off all the time, and he refuses to get any sort of genuine medical help for this. He just keeps drinking coffee and taking these over-the-counter prescription drugs, and stuff like that. And so their relationship is getting more and more strained. Excuse me. And so to those on the outside looking in, to everyone else around Rick, I mean, it just looks like, there's something genuinely wrong with him, and he's refusing to talk about it. And so no one knows what to make of, him at this point. And he's getting more haggard, and it's taking a toll on his health. But one day, though, this creature makes a point to reach out and communicate with Rick. He basically draws him into a dream, wherein Rick was already dreaming, but Sleepwalker has enough of an influence, with his connection to the Mindscape, where he's able to change the layout of Rick's dreams to where he's in a spot where he's more comfortable, namely in a movie theater, because this creature who eventually insists that Rick calls him Sleepwalker, you realized that Rick was more comfortable with the subject of film media, and since Rick was a film student, Sleepwalker decided to basically communicate with him and tell him what his story was through a sort of dream movie. And so he it advises Rick to remember that it's only a dream and it's only a movie, that regardless of how real it looks, don't interact with it, because the memories will draw you in if you reach out and make physical contact with them. And so Sleepwalker explains the nature of his race, and as well as what the Mindscape is, and as well as his race's rivalry with the demonic cobweb. But unfortunately, Rick is overwhelmed by what he's seeing, and at one point he reaches out and influences the dreams by making physical contact with some of the avatars that are within this dream. And so, Sleepwalker and Rick have to work together to resolve the situation, because unfortunately, Rick, in his haste for getting assistance in this dream, he calls up the memories of all these superheroes within the Marvel universe, and he's trying to tell them that there's a monster that's trying to kill him through his dreams, which was Cobweb. But at this point, this dream version of Cobweb, excuse me, real quick, I have Barrett's esophagus, and so sometimes I cough when I'm talking a lot, so I do apologize for that, but that's why I'm coughing some during some of my reviews. But anyway, back to the review. So this dream form of Cobweb, which isn't the real form of Cobweb, but is nonetheless a dangerous avatar for Rick's dream, has already left the dream. And so these dream avatars of the superheroes that Rick is familiar with, they see Sleepwalker and automatically assume that he's the threat, to Rick's mind and his dreams. But after this confusion is and misunderstanding is settled, Sleepwalker finishes relaying his story to Rick through this dream movie, and then the two shortly come to an understanding after this. Basically, Rick agrees that whenever he sleeps, Sleepwalker has permission to continue his mission to fight crime, except in this case it'll be on Rick's home planet Earth, specifically in New York, because that's where Rick lives. But it'll also give Sleepwalker the opportunity to explore this new world. And so from there, excuse me, sorry, the series, it basically goes on, to have this dynamic be explored between, Rick and Sleepwalker, because, once Rick realizes that Sleepwalker, in spite of his freakish appearance, is not a monster, but is a rather upright individual who has every intent to help, those in peril. Rick is going out of his way to try and, help Sleepwalker understand his world around him. Like he'll leave notes for him, so whenever he sleeps, Sleepwalker, when he comes out of Rick's mind, he'll see the notes and maybe have an understanding of certain things, things like that. But unfortunately, in his prior desperate measures to stay awake, he had alienated, his friends and his girlfriends so much to where, he's really having to struggle to, get back into people's good graces. And sometimes what ends up happening is, Rick will fall asleep at an inopportune time, or it's inopportune in the sense that it holds him back from, his social life, but it allows Sleepwalker to say, fight crime. In this case, like say, criminals who needed to be apprehended or something like that. And so, it's good that Sleepwalker is apprehending criminals, but it's adversely affecting Rick in his social life. And so it's this constant balancing act. And so, but it feels oddly relatable though. And I think a big part of that is because Rick is a college student, and most people having had some experience with college, I think might be able to relate to this, because there's already a stress of having to balance your school life with your social life, but then you factor in and a creature from another dimension making its home in your head, not entirely by its own choice, and basically you're having to act as its host. That's going to add its own stresses as well. And so it's a really interesting dynamic there, because as adversely as Sleepwalker is affecting Rick in terms of his social life, as well as say, for instance, whenever certain enemies make the connection that Sleepwalker is in the mind of a human, and which in turn puts Rick in danger while he's asleep, or awake sometimes. It's definitely a stressor on Rick's psyche, but at the same time though, because the two have gotten to understand each other, it's something that Rick is trying to work through, and so Sleepwalker in turn is a stranger in a strange land, and as much as he wants to just go out and fulfill his mission, apprehending dangerous entities from the Mindscape, he's not able to do so because of him being trapped in Rick's mind, and he's doing the next best thing, and he's apprehending criminals. He's wanting to do the right thing, but he's also trying to moderate himself, to a point where he's not adversely affecting Rick so much as he inadvertently was. And so there is progress in the way the two communicate and work with one another, to a point where they bicker sometimes, but they do eventually come to regard each other as genuine friends, as brothers almost. So I really liked that dynamic though, because it's something that it wasn't just because you instantly it wasn't something to where Rick realizes there's something in his head and he's instantly okay with it. Once he realizes this thing is a good guy, it's more like, okay, this is going to take some getting used to. And I really liked that. So there was that sort of believability about it. I mean, you got the fact that he's a college student, with his own, life trying to juggle, and then you got, him trying to adapt to this, big change, and that's, coming his way. And so he definitely had that good main character dynamic going. And oddly enough, the character of Rambo, Rick's dog, is probably one of the most endearing characters, in the book, at least within the issues I've read so far. Because, Rambo is a very smart dog. Rick had somehow, trained Rambo, basically to turn on, say, the radio, the TV, and, sometimes even to turn on the alarm clock, and, whenever Rick has accidentally turned it off, that kind of thing. So, I mean, he's a college student. One alarm clock's probably not going to do a trick for him. So, but Rambo, though, is a very smart, very loyal dog. And he even becomes, one of Sleepwalker's best friends, and it's kind of bittersweet because Rambo, him being a dog is, turns out to be, one of, the few people besides Rick and Alyssa that's genuinely a loyal friend to him. And because, unfortunately, Sleepwalker, being as, freakish looking as he is, inadvertently terrifies the very people he's trying to protect. And, unfortunately, humans, not the humans, as a rule, tend to fear what they don't understand, or they tend to judge on appearance. I mean, I've been guilty of that myself. And so, they see Sleepwalker, and they either misunderstand what he's trying to do, or they just think that, oh, he stopped this guy who was trying to mug me, but oh my God, he's looking right at me. What's he gonna do? He's gonna fry me or something. And so, unfortunately, you've got, the negative human interaction that Sleepwalker constantly has to deal with. And so whenever, he interacts with Rambo, it's like a calm oasis for him. I mean, I'm not trying to, get too psychological here. It's just that, I mean, I'm sure most people, they can relate in the sense that, they have a hard time dealing with, their fellow human beings, but they have a pet that they can come home to. They have a pet that, is always going to, love them and be loyal to them. And so, just as Rambo is loyal to Rick, he's also, loyal to Sleepwalker. And so I actually thought that was, a nice, little touch there. Alyssa, thus far, I kind of have mixed feelings with her because in some respects, I think she's giving, Rick, too much grief as far as, her, frustration with him, and to a point where she eventually breaks up with him. But at the same time, considering the fact that, Rick is having a very difficult time, trying to work up the courage to tell her that, yes, there's this creature in my head, and it only comes out when I'm asleep. But he's not a bad guy. But, he's afraid that if he tells her that, she's going to think he's crazy. And in some ways, I mean, it's an understandable concern on Rick's part. And just as it's understandable that Alyssa, gets so frustrated that she eventually decides to take a break from Rick, I mean, that's understandable too. I mean, because you got this guy who, I mean, he was a loving, good boyfriend, but is, all of a sudden, every time you turn around, he's falling asleep on you, and he's refusing to go to a doctor, that, or what have you. And so even when he tries to, woo you and with, promises of, hey, I'm working on it, and we'll make things better, and he just keeps falling asleep. I mean, that can be a frustrating thing, I'm sure. And so, it's not that I, didn't understand Alyssa's frustration. I just think that, if she knew that there was something going on with Rick, I mean, maybe she could have been a little more supportive. although there is a mitigating factor there, because she's one of the few humans, as I briefly mentioned, who doesn't see Sleepwalker as a monster. I mean, she sees him for, the good person that he is. I mean, because she literally sees him in action, saving people's lives, including Rick's and hers. And so she knows that he's not a bad guy, and she's like one of the few people that actually trusts him. And so, you have that going. And also, a lot of this stuff happens within the first couple of issues. I mean, in terms of, her falling out with Rick. But they make it clear, the creative team makes, it clear that a lot of time is passing. Like, it's not just, one day they're together, then, boom, suddenly, she's frustrated with him and breaks up with him. It's more like, they make it clear, even if it's only like 2 or 3 issues within, when all this happens, they make it clear that several days are going by. And so there is a, logical transition of time, or progression of time. And so, I mean, that makes, I mean, as harsh as I think Alyssa is towards Rick, at the very least, it's not something that's happening overnight. And even if it's only within the first couple of issues, it feels like it's something that's happening over time. And so I thought that, like I said, I had mixed feelings about her, but I can't, just, say I don't like her character, because I can at least understand why she's frustrated. And they made it clear that, it's something that's been going on for days now, that kind of thing. But yeah, so I think that another thing that I thought was unique about this series, specifically the first 11 issues, is the set of villains that Sleepwalker goes up against. Some of them, I mean, there are a couple of familiar faces. I mean, for one, I mean, you have Kingpin, pops up in a couple of issues, but mainly though, as far as, with the exception of Kingpin, the villains within these 11 issues are, entirely original creations, created specifically for Sleepwalker. You have the character of 8-Ball. You can see him right here, who obviously is a pool-themed villain. He's actually a scientist who worked in rocket propulsion for a for a military company, and he also happened to be really good with pool. But he was fired from his job when they believed that he was selling company secrets to less than reputable people, because he actually had a massive gambling debt. Even though they couldn't prove anything, and even though he wasn't doing it, they went ahead and fired him. So he decided to get back at them and the world by combining his career, as in missile technology, with his hobby of playing pool, and that's how he got 8-Ball. And so he has a group of guys who are similarly attired. They're also sort of pool ball themed as well. And so despite their goofy looks, they, under the leadership of 8-Ball, are rather capable thieves. Maybe dim-witted, with the exception of 8-Ball, because he's their leader. But 8-Ball, despite his goofy appearance, actually proves to be a tough villain for Sleepwalker. And their first fight ends in something of a draw, partially because Rick unfortunately awakes just when Sleepwalker's on the verge of turning 8-Ball and his henchmen into the police, and because Sleepwalker disappears as Rick's awaking, 8-Ball and his men are able to, hightail it out of there. And so, unfortunately, the police, they see this, and they assume that Sleepwalker did it on purpose and that he's in cahoots with them. And so, you have misunderstandings like that just make things, more complicated for Rick and Sleepwalker. You also have, characters like, Bookworm, Crime Wave, the Chain Gang, Mr. FX, Lullaby. I mean, these are all, characters who, they sort of have a monster of the week vibe to them, but they are very unique. And even if they only appear in, say, 1 or 2 issues, I mean, they make an impression because, it's clear that the creative team was having some fun with putting them together. In the case of Bookworm, for example, due to a freak mechanical accident that unfortunately also involves Sleepwalker, this, outcast, a social outcast who handled dream research technology, ends up gaining the power to make anything he reads come to life. So he could be reading a book about, say, King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and suddenly King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are standing right there, and he can make them do whatever he wants. Or if he's reading about Greek mythology, he can have a horde of Amazonian women chase you down and start to, scalp you, things like that. And so, seeing as how, this is a social outcast who's been bullied by several people, he decides to, take, his anger out by using his newfound power to go after people who have wronged him. So, it is a bit cliche in the sense of, him being a social outcast, and he checks a lot of boxes. He checks off a lot of the boxes that you see in someone, of this, type of character. But it's the ability that he has that makes him unique. If not his personality, then at the very least, the level of threat he's able to pose to Sleepwalker. And Alyssa actually is able to help Sleepwalker defeat Bookworm with some cleverness and switching of props, as it were. And I'll leave that to you if you want to read it. But and then you have the character of Crime Wave, who is an aspiring mob boss. And he basically ends up pissing off the kingpin, which is never a good thing to do if you're in the criminal underworld. And so due to Crime Wave's schemes, Spider-Man gets involved in the series at this point, and for 2 issues, he and Sleepwalker have one of those classic misunderstandings, and then they have a fight, and then they realize that, oh, hey, we're both good guys, and we're both trying to go after the same guy here, and they have a team up. And granted, stuff like that's been done before, but it's one of the more comical ones, because you have Sleepwalker, who is still trying to understand more about the world around him. And he's so naive on humanity's version of crime that, case in point, in issue 2, he literally has to have, the villain, 8-Ball, explain to him the concept of crime as humanity understands it. And so when that having that said that, once he, comes into contact with Spider-Man, he's wanting to know who and what Spider-Man is because he's moving around like an insect, but he's clearly human. And so, the two of them, it's like they're playing 20 questions. Sleepwalker is asking the questions, and Spider-Man's, much to his confusion and mounting frustration, is trying his best to answer his questions, except that he's trying to go after Crime Wave and Sleepwalker slowing him down, and so that's where the two butt heads, and then you get the rather hilarious moment wherein Sleepwalker and Spider-Man actually switch places. Sleepwalker is able to construct a sort of a sort of improvised Spider-Man costume, and disguise himself as the real deal. When Crime Wave initially had captured Spider-Man and was going to unmask him on live television, and this was all in a scheme to further embarrass the Kingpin, because Kingpin could never defeat Spider-Man and unmask him on live television. That's something that he never did, and so Crime Wave is going to unmask him on live television and then kill him, and basically embarrass Kingpin in front of his fellow mob bosses. But once Sleepwalker switches places with the real Spider-Man, you get this classic moment where Crime Wave takes Spider-Man's mask off, only to reveal a green bug-eyed alien, which freaks out everyone there. And that's when the real Spider-Man comes in, and so he and Sleepwalker team up and take out Crime Wave's forces and Crime Wave himself. And also, Crime Wave should learn from this, not to be a bad boss to your henchmen, because if you're a bad boss to your henchmen, they tend to go over to the competition. In this case, the Kingpin. So yeah, that was one of those instances where you had a villain who, you've been there, done that, but you have a villain who is playing second fiddle to the comedy act of Sleepwalker and Spider-Man, but it's still a good storyline, though. It was called Web of Confusion. But and then you have the Chain Gang, who were 4 convicts who were much like the character of Bookworm. There was a freak accident with technology, and they ended up in a position to where if the 4 of them were chained together, they had each of them had a sort of super ability, and they decided to use these abilities to commit crimes. They are criminals after all, and they actually managed to pose something of a threat to Sleepwalker, and he basically had to use his wits to determine what their weaknesses were, and namely by undoing the chain, which they didn't make easy. But so they go on to become sort of a classic foe of Sleepwalker, along with the character of 8-Ball. And then you have the character of Mr. FX, who is, as his name suggests, a visual and makeup effects artist who unfortunately uses real people as his makeup subjects. Namely, he'll use real people and brainwash them with this technology, these sort of attachments and what have you, and to a point where they're zombified, and then he'll just slap all sorts of monstrous makeup and costuming on them, to where it's like you go to a spook house and you see these monsters and they look fantastic, but the thing is they're zombified people underneath those costumes, so they really are monsters at this point. And then you have the character of Lullaby, who was once a babysitter, but then she realized that she has something hypnotic in her voice, so she went from making her charges, the kids she was watching, do whatever she wanted to do. Like, she had them doing her job description, like she had them cleaning up the kitchen and what have you, and then she realized that she could do the same thing with adults, and so she basically tries to get to where she can babysit for rich couples, and then she'll convince the guy through her voice, through her song, to dump his wife and marry her, and then leave her all the money, and then he will tragically commit suicide. And so Sleepwalker interferes with her schemes, and she initially thinks that he is under her thrall, but it turns out that it's a trick. She had actually somehow she had gotten a hold of Rick over the phone, which was actually a pretty spooky scene, because Rick, he answers the phone, and Lullaby's voice goes through the phone to his ears, and to where he follows her. I mean, he does what she says, and he's a slave to her when she was trying to get a hold of Sleepwalker. So, this mental connection, it has its problems sometimes. But, basically, she puts Sleepwalker in a position to where if he tries to capture her, she'll compel Rick to walk out in front of oncoming traffic so he can get hit by a car. And so he lets her hypnotize him. But it turns out that he was playing along until he could figure out a way to trick her into releasing Rick from her spell. And then he drops a bombshell on her. Sleepwalkers don't sleep. And so that's when he turns her over to the police. And so it's you have a very interesting assortment of villains, even if they're monster of the week types. But the main threat, though, they save the best for last, in my opinion. Basically, when you feel like the shit's hit the fan, so to speak, is when Colonel Tolliver Smith and the OEI comes onto the scene. The OEI stands for the Office of Insufficient Evidence, and it's a branch of the government that basically, anytime something happens where, say for instance, the authorities can't prove that there's something wrong, they'll send the OEI to wherever the situation is to either coerce or manufacture the evidence that they need so the government can step in and do whatever they want to do. In this case, because of all the structural damage that Sleepwalker has done, I should point out that the main ability that Sleepwalker has in the waking world is that he has these eye beams that once they're focused on something, he can look at an object, and use these eye beams to manipulate it and distort it. Case in point, if he's going after, say, a criminal, he can make a mailbox basically sort of come to this twisted form of life and open itself up to where it sort of swallows the criminal who's trying to get away from Sleepwalker. I mean, it doesn't really eat the guy, but it just sort of like and the guy's stuck in there. He's like, help, get me out of here, So you got a lot of little funny moments like that. Or when he's trying to interrogate a criminal, it's a confrontation that happens to take place at a playground at night. Sleepwalker basically pushes this guy onto a swing set, and he uses his eye beams to make the swing set go like a billion stories up into the air, and the guy is just hanging above the ground, looking down on a small swing set, and he's terrified. And sure enough, Sleepwalker gets the information he needs from the guy, but he leaves the guy dangling up there. And so, basically Sleepwalker said, I promised I wouldn't hurt you, and I've kept my promise. And so, I mean, he has every confidence that Earth's authorities will get the guy down. But anytime the authorities come into the scene, like the fire department or what have you, they're like, how the hell did this happen? So, whether it be like fire escapes, warped and, tied up around, criminals, being dangled upside down, it's like stuff like that. It's just like all these things keep adding up to where, the government kind of takes notice, and that's when they send Colonel Tolliver Smith, in the OEI to find out what's going on. And Tolliver Smith is one of those guys who is very gung-ho, and basically sees anything that is not human as a threat. And so basically he takes it upon himself to have him and the OEI go throughout the neighborhood that Sleepwalker's been defending, and they track his radiation signature, which he ends up leaving anytime he uses his eyes. And so they basically force themselves into the homes of the very people that he's actually ended up protecting, and destroying property and things like that, and terrifying the people they're claiming to protect. I mean, it's like government tax dollars at work, people. But they eventually have a rather insidious method to get to the bottom of who and what Sleepwalker is, and because they determine that Sleepwalker is dwelling in the mind of someone in the area. And so they basically force the population of this area of New York to be in a line, and one by one they're forced to don this helmet that has like all these gadgets attached to it. And once it scans them to try and figure out if Sleepwalker's in there, it basically hurts them. And even the police officer or detective, I think, or she was a captain, I think. She's even this captain who was initially for government assistance in finding out what's going on and who and what Sleepwalker is. Once she sees what they're doing to innocent civilians, I mean, she basically is like, okay, I'm not doing this. This isn't what I signed on for. But unfortunately, because she signed some stuff, she basically had turned over all authority to these guys. And so like there's a lot of red tape and what have you. But eventually, though, I mean, Sleepwalker is found out. He's captured, and he's forced to wear these goggles that prevent him from letting loose with his eye beams, and it keeps. And what's going to happen is this energy is going to keep building up and building up, because basically they're forcing him to expend this energy, but these goggles that they forced him to wear is harnessing this energy. And what's going to end up happening is this energy is being sent back into him. And so whenever his human host wakes up, Sleepwalker, when he goes back into the mind of his human host, is going to be forced to let all this energy out. And that is what's going to kill the human host. And once the human host is killed, Sleepwalker's dead. And so, they came very close to defeating Sleepwalker, but with the assistance of Danny Ketch, aka Ghost Rider, who happened to be in the vicinity and was drawn to the suffering of the innocent as they were being forced to wear this helmet to be scanned. Basically, he goes after Tolliver's henchman and comes very close to giving Tolliver the penance stare. But the problem is, Tolliver is the only one who knows how to unlock the goggles that are on Sleepwalker, that are locked on to his head, literally. And so Sleepwalker is, trying to keep Ghost Rider from, permanently scarring Tolliver, because if Tolliver can't talk, then he can't safely unlock the goggles. And if he can't safely unlock the goggles, then Sleepwalker is going to, against his will, kill his host Rick. And so at first Ghost Rider is thinking, Sleepwalker is basically, turned traitor because, he tried to help Sleepwalker. He saw that Sleepwalker is being tortured, and that's why he was going after this guys, along with the fact that, human beings were being tortured as well. And so he's thinking that because Sleepwalker's stopping him from using his penance stare on Tolliver, then he must be on their side. And so the two of them have this really brutal fight until, Sleepwalker realizes that Rick's waking up. And so he begs Sleepwalker to kill him before it's too late. And once Ghost Rider realizes that, there's a lot more at stake than, his ego, he's like, okay, what's going on here? And so Sleepwalker hurriedly tells Ghost Rider what's happening. And so, the two of them sort of do a good cop, bad cop on Colonel Tolliver. Basically, threatening to where Ghost Rider is playing the bad cop and Sleepwalker is the good cop. But basically, bad cop will use his penance stare on him and probably burn him alive as well if he doesn't give Sleepwalker the key to unlocking the goggles. And so once a promise to not kill him is made, or to otherwise permanently traumatize him, he gives the key to Sleepwalker, and Sleepwalker is able to get the goggles off and let loose with the burst of energy, and thus Rick is saved. And Tolliver and his men go his way, and Ghost Rider reluctantly allows them to leave since he gave his word as well. But he did warn Tolliver that justice would come for him eventually, whether it be from him or from someone else. This was also, I forgot to mention, Deathlock, Michael Collins, guest stars in the same story that Mr. Effects features. And you have Sleepwalker and Deathlock initially having a misunderstanding fight, and then an understanding and team up as well, because Deathlock initially thinks that Sleepwalker is a monster, considering that the two of them end up meeting in the same funhouse that Mr. Effects is, and Deathlock had just been attacked by these monsters, that turn out to be human beings, in costume, created by Mr. Effects. And Sleepwalker had actually damaged Deathlock, but then he realized that Deathlock was a living being, or semi-living being, because he is a partially dead cyborg. He does his best to right the situation, and once they have Mr. Effects on the run, Sleepwalker uses his eye beams to actually repair the damage to Deathlock, which kind of shows you just how powerful Sleepwalker is when it comes to, say, fine-tuning his abilities and focusing on things. But you have that bit where people looked at Deathlock and think that he's a monster, and Deathlock initially thought that Sleepwalker was a monster, but the two of them realized that they're both outcasts, just trying to help out their fellow man, so to speak. And so the two of them actually end up parting on good terms. But yeah, this was I really enjoyed these 11 issues, this first arc, because I think that it did a good job of sort of having that sort of 70s feel to say the dynamic between the heroes and the villains, as well as the main characters and the guest stars, but it also gradually got more and more dark as the issues went on. Case in point, you got the character of Lullaby, who is basically mind raping, her victims, except, because this is a code approved, comic geared towards, an audience presumably in the, teens to, college age crowd. I mean, they can't come right out and say, the word rape, but that's essentially what she's doing, and there's an instance in which it's the moment when Sleepwalker is having to pretend that he's under her thrall, so she won't kill Rick. There's a bit where she brings these two guys home, two guys that she met at this club, but she used her voice to compel them to follow her home, and it's made very clear. I mean, the three of them, they go into a room, the door's closed, and then they come out later, and basically she says, she kisses them to where like her lipstick's on their face, and she says, let your wives see the lipstick before you snap out of it. And so, I mean, yeah, that's female on male rape, mind rape, which definitely adds an element of darkness to it, especially, considering the fact that, her demeanor is so perky, which kind of makes, the, threat element, a little more spooky, if you think about it, because it's one thing coming from a character who is, clearly and obviously evil, such as say like, Tolliver Smith or Mr. Effects. I mean, you have Mr. Effects being the, mad scientist type. I mean, their evil is obvious. I mean, there's nothing, deceitful about it. Whereas, with Lullaby, it's more like, I mean, yeah, she comes across as, perky and, affably evil, but when you realize what she's doing, I mean, it takes on a darker edge. And then, of course, you have, the character of Cobweb, who, granted, the introduction we're given to him is through a dream avatar, but what we see of him is very terrifying visually, as well as, when Sleepwalker is explained to Rick what it is that Cobweb does to his victims, which is also mind rape. I mean, it's pretty spooky. So there is definitely that element of the Dark Age, making its way through, to the proceedings. And then of course you have Colonel Tolliver Smith, who is arguably he and the OIE are arguably the most dangerous threat to Sleepwalker within this arc, simply because, I mean, of how far they're willing to go in order to get their man, so to speak. I mean, they're willing to destroy people's homes. They're willing to torture them, even if they don't think it's torture. I mean, the people going through it is torture. And they come arguably the closest to genuinely killing Sleepwalker, namely with the goggles that they force him to put on, because had Ghost Rider not intervened when he did, Sleepwalker wouldn't have been in a position where he could have escaped the contraption he was attached to, and then he wouldn't have been able to eventually explain to Ghost Rider what was going on, and the two of them wouldn't have been able to do the good cop, bad cop thing on Colonel Tolliver. Had Ghost Rider not come onto the scene, Rick more than likely would have been dead. So, so you had like a very interesting, cast of characters that, as the issues went on, like it started off as fun and games, but it got more and more intense as far as the threats that they posed. So I liked that gradual escalation, and as far as like ending an arc, I mean, you should save the best for last, in my opinion, and I think that they did. But I'm gonna go ahead and give the first 11 issues 4 out of 5 stars. I mean, they were good. I will say that if you're unfamiliar with, say, older comics, with, say, like the more innocent or naive tone that some of the comics had, like say in the 70s or earlier, you might feel a bit at odds when reading these issues, because it feels like at times, it's a comic from 2 decades prior to when it was actually written, and simply in terms of like how people react to Sleepwalker, and they're constantly thinking that he's a menace and all that. Like we're talking J. Jonah Jameson, going after Spider-Man type of paranoia, right? Even though Sleepwalker's clearly, helping people out, that kind of thing. That being said, though, because of, I guess you could say, the gradual escalation of darkness that the villains have within these 11 issues, I mean, that's when it feels like, okay, this is definitely something that came out of the 90s. I mean, although it feels at times it came from the 70s, which is ironic because that's when the character was initially, put together by Bob Budiansky, albeit in his rough form, But yeah, but altogether though, I enjoyed these first 11 issues. It had a good cast of characters. You had a good protagonist or protagonists. Rick Sheridan and Sleepwalker. I love their dynamic. How it's a work in progress, but they do become friends. And I'm still 50-50 when it comes to Alyssa. I mean, I like her character. And I understand why she acts the way she does around Rick, but at the same time, it's kind of like, give the poor guy a break, And of course, I love the dog Rambo. Definitely a nice touch to the main character, he's just a cool character, a dog. Go figure. And of course, the Rogues Gallery. They're definitely, unique. As I said, sort of Monster of the Week vibe initially, but at the same time, they do manage to stand out, because they don't really feel like knockoffs of other villains, that kind of thing. Because one thing I will say is that, I mean, at the same time that Sleepwalker came on to the scene, you had some other comics, like, say, Darkhawk or Ghost Rider. They tended to rely on villains from other books. I mean, for case in point, in the first 3 issues that Darkhawk had, like in issues 2 and 3, issues 1 through 3, the first villain he goes up against is Hobgoblin, one of Spider-Man's foes, and he eventually ended up going up against Venom, a few issues after that. Like, I think it was like 13 and 14, or Tombstone, before that. I mean, all of these guys were Spider-Man foes. And Ghost Rider series, the Danny Ketch series, you had Mr. Hyde, who was a foe of the Hulk and Thor, and Spider-Man. You had Flag Smasher, an enemy of Captain America and the Punisher. You had Scarecrow, who was an enemy of Captain America. So, I'm not trying to say that to, say that the villains were lame, or that, the way that Darkhawk and Ghost Rider used these villains were lame. It's just that while they did have some of their own enemies, like their own unique enemies, they tended to rely initially on villains that were not their enemies. That makes sense. Whereas Sleepwalker, I appreciate that they, the creative team of Bob Budiansky and artist Bret Blevins, as well as a guest artist for issue 4, Rick Leonardi. I liked how they came together to create villains who were legitimately unique, and that the one villain that they had who was, in someone else's Rogues Gallery was Kingpin, and he wasn't even the main villain in the storyline he was in. It was Crime Wave who was the main villain, and Kingpin was a supporting antagonist. But aside from Kingpin, all the other villains were original creations, and I appreciated that. But anyway, though, yeah, first 11 issues, I'm going to give 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good first arc, and I'm definitely looking forward to rereading some of the issues that come after this, and reading for a first time the ones that I have not gotten around to. So it was fun looking, back at this series, and it's fun to actually do a review on it. And so, real quick, I'll go ahead and show you all the cover art. So this is issue 1. This is, you see the eye beams that he's using, how it distorts, his surroundings. He's using the ground to sort of, almost liquefy and wrap itself around the bad guy there. One other thing I was going to point out is that Sleepwalkers, they have not just our main character Sleepwalker, but the Sleepwalker race in general. They've basically sworn, not to use their eye beams, on living beings. Basically because of how much damage and trauma that these eye beams do to living beings. Basically they only use them. They're supposed to only use them in the Mindscape, on the foes that you find within this other dimensional plane. The monsters that try and consume the minds of living beings as they sleep. But because Sleepwalker is in a unique situation, and he's not able to go back to his Mindscape, or his home in the Mindscape. I mean, when he's not in Rick's head, he's in the real world, and so he has the eye beams, and he can still use them on inanimate objects, but he's basically sworn, like the rest of his race, to not use them on living beings. And so, like when he went up against Deathlock, for example, and found out that Deathlock was actually a living being and not just a mindless automaton, he freaked out because he's like, oh my god, I broke my vow, that the Sleepwalkers took, that kind of thing. And so, but anyway, sorry. But yeah, so that's his eye beams in action right there. Lanky looking fella. Issue 2. Also, another thing I like on some of the issues, if you look in the corner here, and they have this little picture here that sort of pokes fun at what's going on in the actual story. So you literally have Sleepwalker with an 8-ball there. And you got issue 3. You look right here, it's like a film stock right there. Because this is the one where Sleepwalker tells Rick, his origin story. And as I said, it was in a dream that Rick was having, and Sleepwalker manipulated it to where it was like Rick was in a movie theater. So, and these are all the dream avatars of all the heroes that Rick knew. And so, and here's issue 4. This is the one where Rick Leonardi filled in to do guest art. So you have cover art and interior. And Rick Leonardi, just so you know, was the main artist for another really cool 90s comic, Marvel comic called Spider-Man 2099, which was written by Peter David. But Rick Leonardi, that was some of his best work in my opinion. So it's really cool to see him do Sleepwalker. But yeah, this is where Bookworm's introduced. So you see, he's got the book, and he's got the fictional characters coming out to attack. And then you got number 5, part 1 of Web of Confusion. And this is, I think, my favorite, cover by Bret Blevins. He did the interior and cover art. But this is easily, I think, the most exciting, probably the most detailed of the covers that, he did for Sleepwalker, in my opinion. And I mean, it looks like something Todd McFarlane would do, so I think there might be an influence there. But at the same time, though, I mean, you look at it, you're looking at Bret Blevins, so. I mean, you also kind of have like that sort of, spooky, vibe that he's really good doing too. And you got Sleepwalker right there, making his way through the webs. But yeah, definitely my favorite Sleepwalker cover by Blevins. Number 6, this is part 2 of Web of Confusion. And yes, Spider-Man is confused here. But yeah, this is really a good one though. This is the one where the underworld was briefly under the impression that Spider-Man was actually a bug-eyed alien. So yeah, that was a fun twist. And this is number 7. This is where the Chain Gang is introduced. And I kind of like this cover too, simply because of Bret Blevins, who he's really good at doing moody, horror type art. I mean, you kind of see that vibe here, with the faces of the Chain Gang sort of just melding and merging together here. It looks like. I mean, that doesn't actually happen in the comic, but it's like you got the chains wrapping around like some out of Hellraiser almost, but. Oh, and I like that part. I like the little, he's like, what the? Number 8, this is where he has the altercation and then team up with Deathlock. It was always good to see, Michael Collins again. Deathlock was just a really cool character, and him being a guest star in the Sleepwalker series was, an inspired touch in my opinion. Considering like the two of them do have the similarities to being outsiders in society. But this is when, he uses the I-beam and it really messes up Deathlock's arm. So thankfully he repairs it. Issue 9, Lullaby. So yeah, I mean, she doesn't look like a serious threat, but she actually is. And then, number 10. This is where Tolliver and the OIE comes into play. I like this, moody shot here, because I mean, you got these, harsh-looking henchmen, but then you got Sleepwalker kind of, his back against the wall, right behind them, looking down. And last but not least, number 11. And yes, this does involve a guest appearance by Ghost Rider, which tended to happen a lot in the comics of the 90s. But this was, in my opinion, a good guest appearance, and they actually made it work, made his character, work in the story of, in the context of Sleepwalker's story. But, and there you go, Sleepwalker's head on fire. But oh, and the other thing is, Bret Blevins, shortly after his last issue on Sleepwalker, he, for a very short period of time, went to work on the 90s Ghost Rider series for, I think, 6 issues. And so it was pretty cool, seeing him draw Ghost Rider here, before his work on the actual Ghost Rider series. And in my opinion, I think his work on Ghost Rider in this issue of Sleepwalker is for the most part better than his work in the actual Ghost Rider series. Go figure. But yeah. So those were the first 11 issues of Sleepwalker. Thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments? Let me know, and hopefully you enjoyed what you saw. And if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe. Y'all have a good night. Bye.